Okay, we are going to continue with our Plagues in the Palace story about Meshach and the story of the Exodus. We are in chapter 9. The sun's early morning rays slanted in through the open doorway of the royal kitchens as Meshach slid another batch of bread into the clay brick ovens. As always, whenever he could, Meshach came to the kitchens to work with his father. Today, again, Meshach's mother, Jerusha, could not teach the boys their reading and writing lessons. Again, some of the mothers in Goshen needed her help. Meshach was only too glad to have another day away from his studies. Working in the kitchens was hot, but Meshach knew it was better than working outside on Pharaoh's building projects. There, the temperatures rose so high that men would sometimes faint from heat exhaustion. And besides, the events of the courtroom the day before were still fresh in Meshach's mind. If anything else should happen at the royal palace, he wanted to be there to witness it. "Did you sleep well last night?" Eli asked Meshach. "I'll say I did." Meshach wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "After all that excitement yesterday, I slept like a baby." "Well, you can be sure that there will be more excitement where that came from." Eli gave his son a knowing wink. "I hope so," Meshach called over his shoulder as he turned to go to one of the storerooms to get some more grain for grinding. "Moses and Aaron sure have courage." "More than I think I would have." "He's got more courage than he knows what's good for him," snarled a voice behind Meshach. A shadow darkened the doorway of the storeroom. It was Seti, the Egyptian boy who also worked in the kitchen. He stood with his hands on his hips as if challenging Meshach to an argument or even a fight. Meshach just stood looking at Seti, not knowing what to do. He should have guessed Seti would have something to say about the showdown in Pharaoh's court the day before. "Just who do you Hebrews think you are?" Seti taunted. "Ha! You're slaves. That's what you are. Moses, your so-called deliverer, has no business telling us Egyptians what the Hebrews will and will not do." There was scorn in Seti's voice, and Meshach could see the muscles in his arms and neck tighten. Meshach straightened up to make himself as tall as he could. "We may be slaves now, but someday we will be free." Meshach hoped that he didn't sound afraid. He wanted to be bold and brave, but right now he felt very small and unimportant. With shaking hands, he scooped up a basket full of wheat from a pile of grain on the floor, and then lifted the basket to his shoulders. "Free," Seti sneered. "You will always be slaves in Egypt, because Ra is all-powerful. He's the rising sun of Egypt, and Pharaoh is his son. All nations must bow to the will of Ra and Amenhotep." Seti spat on the floor. "Your God is weak, if he lives at all. Where's his image anyway? I'd like to see it." Meshach swallowed hard. He had no image of Jehovah, but that was because Hebrews were not supposed to make images to him. Meshach knew that from all of the stories his father had told him about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there were other reasons too. No one really knew what Jehovah looked like. Meshach remembered the story about Father Abraham entertaining Jehovah and the two angels. And then there was the story about Jacob wrestling with Jehovah the night before he met Esau. But what did Jehovah really look like? Did he have arms and legs like people? Or did he just make himself look like a human when he appeared to Abraham and Jacob? Meshach didn't know what to say. He didn't want to fight Seti, but he was afraid it might come to that. He could tell it was what Seti really wanted. Meshach wasn't sure he could be brave and stand up for Jehovah right now, but he knew how he'd feel if he didn't. And then, suddenly, the pride in his Hebrew heritage welled up inside of Meshach. It didn't really matter what Jehovah looked like. Jehovah was Meshach's God. He was the God of the Hebrews. Meshach knew he had to do something. Meshach stepped towards Seti. "My God is Jehovah," he said. sticking his chin out proudly. "He is the one and only invisible God. I wish you could know him as I do." "Before many days pass," said he, "the whole world will know that he is Lord of heaven and earth, and that there is no God like him." The words were coming easier now. "And Seti," Meshach added confidently, "Jehovah will set us free. He has promised it." Meshach stepped toward the doorway, and Seti moved to the side to let him pass. Meshach hoped he looked as brave as he felt. He could feel Seti glaring at him as he walked back into the kitchen. Meshach began pouring some grain into a small, hollowed-out stone mortar. With a round stone, he began to rub the grain back and forth. Over and over again he ground it until flour had formed in the bottom of the mortar. "Son, I'm proud of you." Eli's low voice softly spoke over Meshach's shoulder. Meshach turned and smiled. "You heard our conversation?" It was hard not to. Seti was shouting. Eli smiled and then added, "You did well. You kept things from getting out of hand, and yet you spoke up in the name of Jehovah." Eli laid a hand on Meshach's shoulder. "You stood for Jehovah just as we expect he will soon stand for us." Meshach grinned again. It felt good to know that he had stood up for something he believed in. Meshach scooped the flour out of the mortar and then put in some more wheat. He began grinding the grain again until he had enough flour for another batch of bread. The smell of warm bread filled the kitchen, reminding Meshach that the morning's first batch of bread must be finished baking. He straightened his back and went to help his father take the golden brown loaves from the oven. It was only mid-morning, but already Meshach was hungry. He broke off a piece of bread and let the aroma fill his nostrils before he bit into it. It smelled delicious. The round, flat bread was used by the Egyptians for nearly every meal. It was a main part of their diet. As Meshach slid the wooden paddles under the crusty loaves, Hatshepsut, the chief steward of the palace, entered the kitchen. "Eli," he called, as he laid a piece of papyrus on one of the wooden tables. "I've got an important task for you. Pharaoh Amenhotep has summoned all the governors of the provinces to come to the royal palace for their yearly feast in honor of the gods Osiris and Isis. This is the time of year when everyone prays for the seasonal blessings of prosperity throughout the land. So it's important, as I'm sure you know." He smiled and looked directly at Eli. "The governors have also brought their wives with them, and Queen Tyee is providing a banquet for them tonight. She has asked that you serve them personally. She speaks highly of your skills in the bakery here." Eli wiped his face with a white linen cloth, and then bowed from the waist. "Queen Tyee is too kind. However, I will be honored to do my best and see that she is not disappointed." "Very well, then. Here is the list of banquet items that she has requested. You will note that there are several specialty items: sesame cakes, honey wafers, and those fancy melon platters of yours. She says she knows of no one who makes them quite like you do." Hatshepsut raised his eyebrows. "You are a splendid baker, Eli, and you know how to put on quite a show with your delicacies." Hatshepsut slid the parchment toward Eli. "I will begin the preparations immediately." Eli bowed again. "What time does she wish to be served?" "At dusk, just after the evening lamps have been lit. And now I must be going," he added as he turned to leave. "I have much to do myself before then." Eli immediately began making preparations for the feast. "Meshach," he called, "go to the storeroom and collect the ingredients we will need. Bring the fine flour from the large stone jar on the shelf, and ask Seti for some of the honey they use to flavor the beer." Meshach turned to obey his father, but he was afraid. He didn't want to talk to Seti. He didn't want another confrontation so soon after the first meeting in the storeroom. However, he needn't have worried. Suddenly, There was a shout in the corridor leading to the kitchen. "We're cursed! We're cursed!" Satet came running into the kitchen. His eyes were big and his breathing was heavy. "There's trouble at the Nile! A scourge has descended upon the river of life!" The other Egyptian workers in the kitchen ran together at the center of the room, surrounding Satet as he staggered in. Sweat trickled down his face and chest. "What happened?" Eli demanded, setting down a basket of loaves. "We're doomed, I tell you!" Satet wailed, his eyes darting from one person in the group to the other. "They have cursed Egypt!" All right, chapter 10. Satet, Eli pushed his way to the front of the group. "Slow down. Stop babbling. Tell us what happened." Satet took a deep breath and swallowed hard, as though he were going to faint. Then his shoulders slumped, and he sank to his knees on the floor. Meshach knew that Satet was superstitious. Most people in Egypt were. Satet was afraid of unlucky numbers. He was afraid of any animal that was black, and he was especially afraid of being around anything that had died. Meshach felt sorry for him. Satet didn't know Jehovah and the peace that a person could have if he trusted in Jehovah. Whatever it was he had seen or heard had spooked him for sure. "I was at the Nile," Satet moaned. "I was with the royal family for their early morning purification rites. I go with Pharaoh Amenhotep and Queen Tyee every morning at dawn to bless the river and the god Osiris. When we arrived this morning, the chieftain, Moses, and his brother Aaron, they were there to meet us." Satet took a quick breath and shook his head as if he were trying to get the memory out of his mind. "I'll never forget the sight as long as I live," he groaned. "As soon as Aaron started talking, I had this terrible feeling that something bad was going to happen. I could feel it in my bones. I could tell by the tone of his voice." Satet put his hand to his face. "Aaron said that the God of the Hebrews had a special message for Pharaoh. He said that because of Amenhotep's stubbornness in refusing to let the slaves go worship Jehovah, calamity is about to come upon Egypt." "Calamity?" Eli was persistent. "What kind of calamity?" "The Nile," Satet croaked. "Aaron told everyone on the riverbank that he was going to strike the water of the Nile with his shepherd's rod, and that the water in the Nile would change into blood. He said the fish would die too, and that the river would soon begin to stink." "So what happened then?" demanded one of the servants. Satet's eyes began to dart about wildly, and his breathing became more rapid. Eli laid a hand on Satet's shoulder to calm him down. "Go on," he urged. Satet took a deep breath. "Well, it happened just like Aaron said it would. He reached out with his rod and touched the water where it laps up against Pharaoh's steps that go down into the water." Satet began to lose control of his voice as it rose in pitch. "It turned! I'm telling you it did! The water began to turn into blood right before our very eyes." "You saw this happen?" someone asked unbelievingly. "It happened, I tell you. I was there." "The water turned to blood. It was awful." Satet began to shake and weep. "What are we going to do?" he wailed. "The Nile is the source of all life. How will we survive without its life-giving waters?" Everyone stared at Satet. A deathly silence fell over the room as each person realized the seriousness of the situation. Most of the servants in the room were Egyptians. Meshach knew that they worshipped the Nile as their god. In fact, every god in Egypt was somehow tied to the worship of the Nile River. The Nile truly did bring life to Egypt. In the spring, at flood tide, the Nile always stretched way beyond its normal banks. When the waters went down, rich river mud was always left behind that made wonderful soil for growing crops. Would the polluted water of the river now ruin the land so that the crops wouldn't grow? Worse still, now that the Nile River was polluted, how would everyone find enough water to drink? Most of Egypt was a desert. Any water that had already been drawn from the river would have to be rationed carefully. More wells would have to be dug, but there was never a guarantee that new wells would even provide water. Suddenly, a servant woman in the kitchen let out a scream. "It's true!" she shrieked. "The water has turned to blood!" And then she fainted dead away. As she toppled to the floor, the clay cup that she was holding fell from her hands, spilling the contents on the floor. A red liquid spread across the floor like a pool of blood. Satet jumped to his feet, knocking over a large clay jar of water, and more of the same red liquid spread rapidly across the tiled kitchen floor. In an instant, everyone was running about the room, scrambling to get away from the ever-widening stain on the floor. They rushed for the door, screaming as though their last day on earth had come. Everyone, that is, except Meshach and his father. As the room emptied, Eli and Meshach simply stood watching the blood-red liquid. The judgments promised by Jehovah have begun. Eli bowed his head solemnly. They reach even to the water we drink and the cups we hold in our hands. Meshach thought for a moment. "How's that possible, Father? Moses cursed the Nile, but the water we drink here in the kitchen was drawn last night." "It's a miracle, son, a strange and miraculous scourge upon the land." Meshach bowed his head. "Then it has finally begun just as Moses said it would? Do you think this is the beginning of the end?" He said the words softly. "Do you think that our deliverance is at hand?" Eli looked out the open doorway to the river Nile beyond. "I believe it is, my son." "Then I want to go to the Nile and see this great wonder for myself." The two of them trudged the distance to the river and stood on the bank staring at the scene before them. "The half was not told us," Eli murmured. "Just look at that sea of red. The whole river has turned to red. To blood red," Meshach whispered, stunned at the fearful sight before them. "All of it." This is indeed the hand of God, and he knows just how to hit the Egyptians where it hurts the most. "You mean because of Osiris, the god of the Nile?" "Partly." Eli glanced at Meshach. "But it's more than that, I'd say. You see, the Nile is a very symbolic part of Egyptians' way of life. Think about it. The Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt, and now God has turned the river itself into blood." Eli and Meshach returned to the kitchen, but there was not much they could do. They couldn't bake anything that required water. All of the cisterns and clay jars of water were full of the polluted liquid that looked and even smelled like blood. In the palace and on the palace grounds, there was much commotion. No one really knew what anyone else was doing. Meshach and Eli wished they could help somehow, but they finally just gave up and went home. When they arrived at home, however, things were not much better. People were running here and there, pouring out the contents of cups and pitchers and water jars. The same blood-red liquid was in the homes of the Hebrews. Meshach could hardly believe his eyes as his mother Jerusha met them at the door. "What's the meaning of this plague that has overrun Egypt?" she asked fearfully. "It's the hand of Jehovah." Eli's voice was steady. "Jehovah is beginning to stand up for his people." "Stand up for his people?" Meshach could hear his mother's voice trembling. "You call this standing up for his people? The land is filled with blood. There's nothing to drink." Meshach stood looking at his mother. It was true. Evil had come to the homes of the Hebrew slaves too. Were the Hebrew slaves no different in God's eyes than the Egyptians? Was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob weak as Seti had said he was? Would he truly stand up for his people? Chapter 11. By the next morning, the stench from the river was beginning to fill the land, and pure water was impossible to find. The river was clogged with thick red ooze, and all the streams that flowed into the Nile had become like blood. Even the ponds, small lakes, and backwaters from the overflow of the flooded Nile had turned a stagnant red. Meshach stood with his father, overlooking the Nile once again, as the sun's orange circle rose over the eastern horizon. Dead fish had begun washing up on the bank at the river's edge, and now and then a dead goat or cow floated by. Already flies were gathering for a feast of rotting flesh. Meshach held his nose. The odor was almost overpowering, and it had barely been 24 hours since the water had turned. It made Meshach's stomach sick just to look at any of it. "What will we do for water?" Meshach finally asked his father. Eli looked at Meshach, concern written on his face. "We'll have to dig wells like everyone else is doing," he replied. Meshach frowned and shook his head. "But father, that's a lot of work, and we don't even know if we'll find water." "There's not much else we can do, son." And so they dug. And as Meshach had guessed, it wasn't easy. Several families got together to help dig for the water they hoped to share. At first, the work went quickly because the ground near the surface was sandy, but below the first layers of sand, the ground was more like clay and full of gravel. It was so hard that they had to use a mattock so that they could chop away at the hard soil. And to haul the soil up to the surface, they had to use baskets. Meshach worked with his father and Uncle Heber for several hours that first morning. Eli's older cousins, Nadab and Abihu, helped too. They all wanted to make some headway before the hottest hours of the day set in. But the going was slow. By noon, the well shafts were still not very deep. "There's not much more we can do now," Eli said as he leaned on the wall of the deepening hole and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "If we keep going like this, we're going to die of heat stroke. We need the water, but it won't help us if we die out here in the sun trying to get it." "You're right," Uncle Heber panted. "We'll just have to come out and start again after the heat of the day has passed." "That's fine by me," Eli agreed. "Nadab, Abihu, can you come out and help again too?" Nadab went to the shade of a date palm tree and sat down. "All right, I suppose that's the only things we can do," he agreed. "But I've got 2 small children at home, so we need to get some water soon." He looked at Eli. "I, for one, would like to know where the God of Abraham is at a time like this. If you ask me, I think he's abandoned us. This whole thing is a dreadful disaster." Nadab's forehead wrinkled into a frown, and Meshach could tell that he was more than just afraid. He was angry. "I thought that Moses said the Lord was going to do marvelous things for his people. Well, where is he now? Where are the marvelous signs that Moses promised us?" Meshach stared at Nadab. How could he say such things? How could he speak against Jehovah, the great I Am? Jehovah was everywhere. Surely Nadab knew that Jehovah could hear the horrible things he was saying. Eli sat down in the shade beside Nadab. "We are seeing the signs Jehovah promised us. The plague of blood is a sign," he replied. "This is just the beginning of what Jehovah will do to make Pharaoh see that he must let us go." "These are the signs?" Nadab retorted. "Well, if that's the case, how is it that Pharaoh's magicians can also turn water into blood?" "This has happened?" Several of the men sitting nearby turned to listen to the conversation, and Meshach could see fear in their eyes. "I heard it just this morning." Nadab glanced around the group of men, a look of triumph on his face. Eli's face grew stern. Their power to do such things does not come from God, but from the evil one. He shook his head. "Moses, on the other hand, uses the power of Jehovah to perform such signs." How do we know that? Nadab blurted. Because we know that no man has the power to do such things. Think about it, Eli insisted. Only the powers of the spirit world can work miracles. Men can do such things only through the power of Jehovah or through the magic incantations of the evil one. Eli paused, and then his voice grew strong with conviction as he turned to look at all of the men sitting in the shade. I'm telling you, brothers, be patient. Wait and see what the Lord our God will do. Don't be afraid. Jehovah is all-powerful, and he will stand up for his people. Well, if he is all-powerful, Nadab kept on, why has he brought this terrible plague on the Hebrews too? Why not just the Egyptians? They're the pagans in this land. No one said anything more. It was obvious to Meshach that no matter what his father said, Nadab would only argue. It seemed that Nadab just wanted to find reasons to fuss and whine and grumble against Moses and Jehovah. Meshach sat thinking about the conversation between the two men. Why did God allow the plagues to come upon everyone? Why not just the Egyptians, as Nadab had argued? Is it somehow a test of our faith? All during the heat of the day, the men sat in the shade of their small mud brick homes, trying to save their energy and body moisture for the job ahead. By late afternoon, word came from the royal city of Tanis that many Egyptians had collapsed in the hot sun, trying to dig wells too. The sun was low in the sky when the men began their work again. Meshach and his cousins, Asher and Zikri, helped too, but they got tired more quickly than the men did. Even the women came to help, pull the baskets out of the sand, gravel, and clay to the surface, and then empty them. And they all took turns holding the sooty torches so that the workers could see in the darkness. At midnight, a shout went up that water was beginning to seep into the shaft that they had dug. And it was pure. There was not even the slightest tinge of red in the water. However, it was only a small trickle. And even though they dug down several cubits deeper, only a small pool of water was collecting at the bottom of the hole. Thirsty hands reached for cups of the cool water and gulped it down. Eli stood to his feet and tried to straighten his aching back. Well, men, it's obvious that the hole we've dug is not going to provide enough water for all of our families. There were worried looks on all of the men's faces. Then what are we going to do? Nadab demanded. We worked this morning and now much of the night. If we don't get enough water, our families will wither like the fields during a drought. We'll just have to dig again, in another place, of course. Another place? Again? What good will that do? Nadab held a torch above his head so he could see Eli's face. If this is all the water we get each time, we'll have to dig a score of holes to get enough water. There are over 40 people in our combined families, and plenty more people will come begging for water once they discover we have some. He scowled at Eli in the light of the torch. And Nadab was right, or so it appeared to Meshach. Already footsteps could be heard coming from every direction as people heard the good news that water had been found. When a crowd of onlookers pushed their way to the edge of the well, Nadab swung his torch around to keep them from coming any closer. Stand back, Nadab shouted. Stand back, I tell you. Don't come any closer. This well belongs to the families of the house of Uzziel. There is none for you. He glared at them all menacingly and held the torch out in front of him as if it were some kind of sword. Go on about your business. Find your own water. Eli stepped forward and raised his voice. Now, just a minute. You can't treat people like this. These people are your brothers. They are the flesh and blood of Israel. Nadab turned the torch on Eli. They can get their own water. This is mine. This is ours. His face looked so angry and his voice sounded so determined that Eli finally backed off. Nadab then turned to look at the other family members standing around. His eyes squinted in the light of the torch, and Meshach could see his clenched teeth together. "If any of you want to dig another well, go right ahead. But I'm going to stand guard over the water we already have in this well. I'm not going to let anyone else profit from the hard work that we've already done." All that night, the rest of the men and boys dug. More family members came to help with the digging, and by morning light, the family had dug 2 more wells. They had chosen a spot near a small stream, and each of these new wells produced more water than the first one had. As day dawned, Meshach could see hundreds of wells being dug all up and down the Nile River Valley. In the afternoon, a detachment of Egyptian soldiers from the city came into the settlement at Goshen and ordered several hundred men to go with them. Eli was one of the men that were taken. When Eli didn't come back for several days, Meshach guessed that Pharaoh must have heard about the success the Hebrews were having in digging wells. He would need slave labor to help dig his own wells. The smell from the Nile hadn't gotten any better by the end of the week, but everyone had gotten used to it by now. The little bit of water they managed to get from their wells was enough to drink, but that was about all. Very little cooking could be done, and of course no one could take a bath. Meshach was almost glad for that. He hated taking baths anyway, except to cool off. Before the plague of blood, he had always liked jumping into the Nile for a swim with his cousins, but now that was impossible. Meshach had tried putting his hand in the water of the Nile once, but the feel of the blood, that blood-red water on his skin, made him tingle. There was no end in sight for the plague of blood, and everyone was beginning to get anxious. Would the Nile eventually become clear again, or would it always be red? Worse still, would anyone get sick from the disease that was sure to follow? Would anyone die? By now, Meshach's father was back, tired, but none the worse for his days of digging wells. However, things were not going so well for Moses and Aaron. Eli came home one night talking about Moses and Aaron meeting with the tribal elders. There had been a lot of arguing among the leaders. Many criticized Moses, and some even questioned God's leading. Meshach couldn't believe his ears as he listened to his father tell about the meeting. Apparently, Korah, one of Moses and Aaron's distant cousins, had been the most outspoken member of the tribal council. If this is Jehovah's way of punishing Pharaoh and all of Egypt, then let it be so, Korah had complained, but leave us out of it. Why must we suffer too? It's Pharaoh's lesson to learn, not ours. That's right, several of the others had shouted. Now just a minute, Moses had interrupted them. Jehovah knows what he's doing. Be strong and courageous, brothers. Don't let this plague cause your faith in Jehovah to waver. It's a test of character for us all. A test of character, Korah jeered. Why do we need a test of character? Haven't all these years of slavery tested our characters enough? He paused, and then he looked around the room. We don't need character. What we need is deliverance from Egypt and from Pharaoh Amenhotep. And we will have it, Moses shot back. We will. We just need to give Jehovah time to work things out in his own way and in his own good time. Korah stood up, his face turning a deep red as he looked straight at Moses. In his own good time? Well, I say now's as good a time as any. He clenched his fist and waved it in the air. Who died and set you up as our leader anyway? Look at all the trouble you've caused us, Moses. It's been a week now, and Pharaoh still hasn't given in. In fact, he's increased our workload now, so that we have to gather all the straw to make his bricks, and we will still have to make the same number of bricks besides. Moses stood his ground. Everything's going to be all right, he insisted. Jehovah said that with a mighty hand He would bring us out from under the Egyptians, and I believe him. He promised to give us our inheritance in the land of milk and honey. What more can we ask for? Milk and honey, huh? Korah spat the words out. I'll believe it when I see it. Moses' face grew stern, and there was a long moment of silence as he glanced at his cousin. I'm ashamed of you, Korah. How dare you question Jehovah? How dare you mock his name and his holy purpose for our nation? You, of all people, ought to be able to stand bravely for Jehovah. Moses turned to look over the entire group of leaders. And I'm ashamed of all of you too, he added. Now hear this. You will see Jehovah's mighty hand as he strikes Egypt with many more plagues, plagues far worse than this plague of blood. You will see Israel delivered from bondage, my brothers, and you will taste the sweetness of freedom. But because of your hard hearts, you will not live to see Canaan. Silence hung over the group. Was Moses a prophet? Only prophets could make such predictions. Could he see the future? Or were his words really Jehovah God's words? Moses stood tall and straight as he raised his shepherd's rod in his outstretched hand. Tomorrow, I'm going to Pharaoh once again to ask that he let Israel go. I know that he will not let Israel go. Not yet. But I must obey the command of Jehovah anyway. I have no other choice. Meshach stared at his father. The story finished. You say all this happened tonight, right here in the land of Goshen? Meshach's eyes were wide with excitement. Yes, it did, son. And tomorrow, there will be another showdown between Moses and Pharaoh. A showdown? Meshach asked. That could mean more trouble for all of us, couldn't it? It could, son. But one thing is for sure. As Jehovah promised our father Jacob so many years ago, he will watch over our people wherever we go. He will bring us back to the land of Canaan.